A single apple can spark a thought. I'm Edwin. The world is not going back to what it was. That is not just a dramatic slogan, it is a structural observation. For decades, many people have looked at the world through the habits of the old system. They assumed that conflicts would be contained, that crises would be managed, that trade would continue to flow, that the dollar system would remain intact, and that when things became dangerous, the United States would still be able to step in and stabilize the situation. But all of these assumptions depend on one deeper condition. They depend on the idea that the United States can still do what it used to do, that it can still control key sea lanes, still dominate critical regions, still reassure allies, and still sustain the global security order. Now, the condition is being tested, so the real question is no longer just whether the Middle East will remain unstable. It is no longer just whether Washington will escalate or step back. The deeper question is this: what happens if the United States loses control of the Middle East? Not necessarily in the form of a formal defeat, and not in the cinematic sense of a single moment of collapse, but in a more realistic sense. What if it can no longer end the war quickly? What if it can no longer stabilize supply lines? What if allies begin to doubt American protection? What if the old regional order can no longer be maintained? What if the cost of staying becomes unbearable, but the cost of leaving becomes even worse? If that happens, the consequences will not remain inside the Middle East. They will move outward into energy, shipping, and trade, into currencies, and eventually into the structure of the global system itself. Because what may be unfolding in front of us is not just another regional war. It may be the moment when an old world order begins to lose its foundation. Let us start with the most immediate layer. Some people assume that if the war becomes too costly, the rational choice for the United States would simply be to step back. On paper, that sounds reasonable, but in reality, withdrawal does not mean the cost disappears. Withdrawal itself becomes a cost, and in this case, a very large one. The American presence in the Middle East is not temporary. It is not a short-term deployment. It is the result of decades of accumulated structure, military bases, logistics routes, intelligence networks, political commitments, naval power, regional alliances, and, most importantly, a strategic credibility. If the United States suddenly pulls back under pressure, what collapses is not just a military position. What collapses is confidence. And once confidence begins to crack, alliances begin to loosen. At that point, regional partners start asking the most practical question in international politics: if the United States cannot hold the line now, why should we continue to rely on it later? This is how geopolitical systems begin to change, not through speeches, not through headlines, but through the silent revision of expectations. Because international politics is not based on loyalty. It is based on power, credibility, and the perceived ability to deliver protection. If that perception changes, the structure changes with it. And once the structure begins to shift, the region enters a new phase. Countries hedge, actors reposition, local powers test new limits, old balances weaken, and the vacuum does not remain empty for long. It gets filled. That is why the United States is now caught in a trap. Continuing the war is costly, but leaving the war may be even more damaging. This is no longer a simple choice between fighting and exiting. It is a choice between different forms of strategic deterioration. And that is what makes the situation so dangerous. So, what about the other path? What if the United States simply continues the war? At first glance, that may appear sustainable. The US still has the strongest military in the world. It still has allies, it still has money, it still has carrier groups, bases, air power, and diplomatic leverage. But modern war is limited by something colder: industrial capacity. This may be the single most important point. Wars, especially large wars and high intensity wars, are not won by rhetoric. They are not sustained by declarations. They are sustained by production. Missiles are not infinite. Air defense systems are not infinite. Precision guided munitions are not infinite. The inventory is always finite, and the production line is always slower than the fantasy of unlimited war. This is where many people misunderstand modern conflict. They imagine war as a contest of will, or a contest of technology, or a contest of political determination. But at a deeper level, war becomes a contest of industrial endurance. How many units can be produced? How quickly can they be replaced? How secure is the supply chain? How complete is the manufacturing base? How many fronts can be sustained at the same time? How long can consumption exceed replenishment before the system begins to strain? These are not abstract questions. They are the real boundaries of power. And once a military consumes in 1 month what industry can only replace in a year, the conversation changes. At that point, the issue is no longer victory in the heroic sense, it becomes exhaustion in the mathematical sense. This is the part many people miss. Modern war has a limit, and that limit is not always political. Sometimes it is physical, sometimes it is industrial, sometimes it is simply numerical. There's only so much a stockpile, only so much manufacturing depth, and only so much redundancy in the system. Once those limits are reached, strategy itself begins to narrow. That is when a superpower starts to discover something uncomfortable. Global influence does not automatically mean unlimited war-making capacity. Now let us take the next step. Even if the United States can continue fighting for some period of time, does that mean it can solve the problem? Not necessarily, because sustaining a war is not the same as achieving a decisive outcome. This is especially true when the opponent is large, deep, resilient, and potentially supported directly or indirectly by other states. This is how many wars become traps. They begin as short campaigns, they become long struggles, they start with the promise of quick resolution, they end in drawn-out attrition. And once a war enters that phase, everything changes. The original military objective begins to recede. The cost begins to rise. The political burden increases. The fiscal burden increases. Alliance management becomes harder. Public patience declines. And every extra month begins to consume strategic resources that were supposed to serve other theaters. This is where time becomes the enemy. Not because time itself is destructive, but because time reveals whether the original assumptions were ever realistic. If a war cannot be ended quickly, then it stops being a limited operation. It becomes a drain, and once that happens, the issue is no longer just the battlefield. The issue becomes global overstretch, because no stockpile is infinite, no budget is infinite, no political tolerance is infinite. And if one critical theater begins consuming more and more strategic energy, then other theaters inevitably receive less. This is the hidden vulnerability of global power. It appears universal, but in reality, it is constrained. It can project a strength across the map, but it cannot necessarily sustain maximum intensity everywhere at once. So if the Middle East becomes a prolonged industrial and a strategic sinkhole, the consequences will be felt far beyond the region itself. And that brings us to the larger system. What happens if the United States does not fully collapse, but gradually loses effective control over the key strategic nodes of the Middle East? This is where the discussion becomes much bigger than war, because the Middle East is not just another unstable region. It sits at the intersection of energy, shipping, security, and monetary order. That is why the issue is not merely influence. It is control over the arteries of the system. Think about what that means. Modern civilization runs on energy, not metaphorically, but literally. It runs on oil and gas, on shipping routes and insurance, on ports, refining, distribution, and the vast web of transport logistics. All of this forms the circulatory structure of the global economy, and certain locations function like valves in that system. The Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb, and the Red Sea corridor. When those routes are secure, the world behaves as if the system is normal. Ships move, insurance works, contracts are written, prices are formed, factories plan ahead, supply chains assume continuity. But once control over those routes becomes uncertain, the first thing that breaks is not necessarily a ship. It is confidence. Markets begin to reprice risk. Insurance premiums rise, shipping reroutes. Inventories are hoarded. Timetables become unstable. Supply chains begin to tighten. In other words, the system starts to lose trust in its own continuity. And that matters because trust is one of the invisible pillars of globalization. Then comes the next layer. Energy disruption is never just about energy. Energy is the base variable. Once it becomes unstable, everything built on top of it begins to shake. Transportation becomes more expensive. Agricultural inputs become more expensive. Fertilizer becomes more expensive. Food becomes more expensive. Industrial production becomes more fragile. This is how a regional shock becomes a civilizational shock. Because the modern world is tightly linked. And tightly linked systems are efficient in times of peace, but brittle in times of disruption. That is why a loss of control in the Middle East could trigger far more than a temporary spike in oil prices. It could expose the full fragility of long-distance interdependent global production. And once that fragility becomes visible, states begin to change their behavior. They stop optimizing only for efficiency. They begin optimizing for survival. They build reserves. They localize production. They secure strategic goods. They expand defense budgets. They reduce dependency. They prepare for interruption. This is how the logic of peacetime globalization slowly gives way to the logic of wartime economics, not all at once, but unmistakably. And once the world begins moving in that direction, globalization does not necessarily end overnight, but it begins to retreat. Now we reach one of the most serious layers of all, money, because if energy routes become unstable, and if geopolitical control over the region weakens, then the monetary system built on top of that order also comes under pressure. This is not because the dollar disappears in a single dramatic moment. It is because the dollar is not just a currency. It is part of a larger structure. Its position has never depended on economics alone. It has also depended on order, on military power, on sea lane security, on alliance systems, and on the credibility of an American-led world. That means the dollar does not float above geopolitics. It is embedded inside it. And if the underlying structure weakens, the currency structure cannot remain untouched forever. This is especially important in energy trade. Energy is not just another market. It is the most strategic and unavoidable market in modern industrial life. If major energy flows begin to move outside the assumptions of the old order, then the monetary implications become serious. Because whoever influences energy settlement influences far more than payment methods. They influence the architecture of financial power. And once that architecture begins to loosen, another process begins. People start searching for anchors, not rhetorical anchors, not ideological anchors, but real anchors. What holds value when systems become unstable? What survives when trust in paper structures begins to erode? Historically, the answer is often the same. When complex orders begin to weaken, value moves downward toward harder forms, toward what is more basic, more tangible, and less dependent on promises. Gold becomes important again for this reason, not because of nostalgia, but because of a structure. When paper systems are stressed, when fiscal burdens rise, when wars expand, when production falls, and when currencies are tied to increasingly fragile estate capacity, people begin to rediscover why hard assets mattered for so much of human history. This is not romanticism, it is a recurring historical pattern. When the system becomes more uncertain, value seeks harder ground. And this brings us to another crucial idea. In a world of prolonged disruption, wealth begins to change its meaning. In stable times, financial wealth seems supreme because people assume that money can always be converted into what they need. But when supply chains fracture, when shipping becomes unreliable, when energy fluctuates violently, when food systems tighten, and when currencies themselves are under pressure, the nominal wealth starts to look less absolute. At that point, the real question changes. Can you get the goods? Can you secure energy? Can you secure food? Can you secure raw materials? Can you secure production capacity? Can you turn financial claims into physical reality? This is what it means to say that the world may move toward an age where physical assets matter more again. Not because money vanishes, but because physical reality starts to dominate financial abstraction. Resources matter more, manufacturing matters more, strategic goods matter more, industrial depth matters more. And once that happens, a very important illusion begins to break. The illusion that finance can permanently dominate industry, the illusion that a monetary system can indefinitely overpower the physical foundations of civilization, and the illusion that real constraints can always be managed through accounting, leverage, and narrative. Eventually, reality returns. And reality is made of energy, metals, food, electricity, factories, ports, machines, and organized human labor. In the end, war returns us to that truth faster than peace does, because war strips away abstraction. It reveals what a system can actually produce, actually defend, actually move, and actually sustain. This leads to a deeper historical question. Why is the United States under this kind of pressure now? Why does the system feel more strained than it did in the past? The answer may not lie only in the war itself. It may lie in choices made over decades, because a great power can outsource manufacturing for a long time and still appear strong. It can benefit from cheaper imports, higher profits, financial expansion, asset inflation, and the prestige of a currency-centered system. But over time, that model has a cost. Industrial depth weakens, supply chains stretch outward, strategic dependence grows, fiscal foundations become more fragile, debt becomes more important, and the industrial base that once supported military power becomes thinner. As long as the world remains stable, these weaknesses can be hidden. Globalization covers them. Sea lanes remain open, inputs remain available, trade flows remain smooth, and the political class can continue pretending that financial dominance is enough. But when the world becomes harsher, the underlying weakness returns to the surface. That is when deindustrialization stops being an economic footnote and starts becoming a strategic liability. That is when military supply problems become visible. That is when production limits matter. That is when geopolitical ambition collides with industrial reality. And that is why this moment may be more than a temporary crisis. It may be the historical echo of a much longer process, a process in which industrial substance was gradually sacrificed while financial and geopolitical reach kept expanding. Eventually, the gap becomes too large. And when that happens, the system begins to strain under its own contradictions. At this point, one clarification is important. This is not an argument that the United States collapses tomorrow. It is not an argument that the dollar disappears overnight. It is not an argument that globalization vanishes in one clean break. History rarely works like that. What matters is not sudden disappearance. What matters is progressive instability. Old systems do not need to vanish immediately in order to weaken. They only need to become harder to sustain. They only need to show more cracks more often. They only need to require more force, more money, and more political energy just to maintain what once felt normal. That is how eras begin to change, not with one final event, but with repeated stress that reveals the structure is no longer as solid as it once seemed. So the real issue is not whether one war will end next month. The real issue is whether many separate events are now pointing in the same direction. A trapped superpower, industrial limits in modern war, strategic sea lane insecurity, fragile energy flows, stressed supply chains, a more militarized global economy, pressure on paper systems, and the rising importance of hard assets, industrial depth, and physical control. If these are not isolated signals, but parts of one larger pattern, then we are not simply watching another crisis, we are watching the conditions of a different world begin to form. And that is where the deepest conclusion lies. The world does not change all at once. Usually it changes when the systems holding it together begin to fail quietly, and then all at once become impossible to ignore. For decades, people lived inside a world supported by sea power, by secure shipping lanes, by dollar settlement, by global supply chains, and by the assumption that large-scale order would continue. Many came to believe that this was natural, that the world simply worked this way. But it was never natural, it was historical, it was contingent, it depended on specific balances of power, production, credibility, and control. And when those balances begin to weaken, the era they supported begins to weaken with them. So the question is not only whether another strike will happen or whether oil prices will move next week. The deeper question is whether the pillars of the old system are beginning to crack at the same time. Sea control, industrial replenishment, alliance confidence, monetary credibility, and supply chain stability. If the answer is yes, then what we are facing is not just another geopolitical emergency. It is the beginning of a more unstable, more material, more competitive, and more unforgiving age, an age in which resources matter more, industry matters more, hard power matters more, and illusions matter less. The world may not collapse in a single dramatic scene, but it may already be leaving the old order behind. And once certain changes begin, they do not simply reverse,